think the AFC North is one of the toughest divisions in the NFL. All four of those teams, I think, are good in abstract terms, which isn't to say that, one of them just catches the bad end of every close game and finishes with like a 6-win season.
So Steelers finished 9-8 last year because, of course, they did. Mike Tomlin. And they're projected for exactly 9.19 wins this year because of Mike Tomlin.
Lock it in.
And that's what they're going to do. A couple off seasons ago, it didn't feel good in Pittsburgh. It felt like not only was Big Ben getting older, but the roster was just slowly getting chipped away at. The offensive line had been chipped away for a few years after they had been one of the more consistent units in the league 4 or 5 years ago. I really think Omar Khan, the new general manager there, has done a nice job building back the depth in Pittsburgh. Now, of course, it's all going to come down to Kenny Pickett and what his year 2 looks like. But the depth in Pittsburgh, we loved their draft this year, some of the players that they brought in. It looks really good on paper, just like the Browns, Ravens, and Bengals. So, what are you looking for this year in Pittsburgh?
Similar story to Baltimore in terms of, I think the focus is actually less on personnel and more on scheme and coaching and what that looks like. But the difference being Pittsburgh's defining characteristic is that they didn't change anything from that point of view, whereas Baltimore's is that they did. Like, the big focus for the Ravens is, what does the new offense look like? The big focus in Pittsburgh is, can the system that didn't change actually take advantage of what looks like a massive influx of really talented playmakers across the board? George Pickens, lighting it up in training camp, making spectacular catches left, right, and center. Deontay Johnson, we know, is one of the best route runners in the NFL, will separate to a really high level. Allen Robinson, fantastic, like buy low, roll of the dice gamble.
Perfect.
Pat Freiermuth at tight end is a good player. Darnell Washington brought in is just an absolute, freak show to see what he can do. As you say, Calvin Austin, dude, I loved last season, is working his way in as a consistent deep threat in this offense, which is huge. Najee Harris, as much as people are souring on him generally, I think is a talented player who's just being let down by the fact that the expectations or the ask for him was unrealistic. That's a really, really good group of playmakers. And I was very impressed by Kenny Pickett, albeit with some very low expectations of him coming in a terrible quarterback draft. The offensive line wasn't bad, and they went out to improve it with guys like Isaac Seumalo and Broderick Jones in the draft. I mean, this offense, from a personnel standpoint, this should be a good group. But if the system stinks, it won't be. Right.
So let's discuss that a little bit, because you summed up the personnel on offense. I agree with everything you're saying. The receiving core, the offensive line, the weakness is tackle, and they grab a Broderick Jones in the first round. Everything's moving in the right direction there. I don't know what happens with Allen Robinson. He's another one of those guys, just take the shot every year because the high-end potential's there. So what do you do with Kenny Pickett? Because there's definitely ways to look at our data and say, man, he played pretty good ball last year after, he's a rookie, after a bit of a slow start. He played pretty well down the stretch. Now, we've certainly gotten burnt by, if you just look at the last 8 weeks of this guy's rookie season and project it forward, like, that doesn't work. That was Sam Darnold had one of the top grades the last 4 weeks of his rookie year, and it means nothing from that perspective. But what Kenny Pickett did, and even Mitch Trubisky, from a PFF grading standpoint, they were both solid, graded in the 70s. They were fine. But the stats weren't great. And, I say this a lot about PFF grades. I think it's a good way to separate the quarterback's contribution versus the rest of the offense's contribution. So when you see Kenny Pickett with like 7 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, like if I just went to like Pro Football Reference and looked up Kenny Pickett's stats, I think, that's a rookie year right there. More interceptions than touchdowns, and everything's pedestrian. But we had him graded far better than those stats showed. And I think what's happened is the offense is not creating the easy, right? It's the opposite of Kyle Shanahan's system, where you don't have to perform at a high level to have gaudy stats. Steelers quarterbacks, it seems, over these last couple of years, have to work really hard to have great stats. And you usually point that to the offense. Usually you look at the offensive coordinator or the playmakers. And I don't think it's the playmakers in Pittsburgh. They have a variety of different styled pass catchers that should work well with Kenny Pickett. The offense also just had a bit of a spark with Pickett over Trubisky, just having QB sneaks and some a few runs here and there that worked. So I like Pickett. I think he'll have a good season. I still don't know if it's going to show up on the stat sheet.
The contrast between Kenny Pickett and Brock Purdy last year is fascinating because they had very, very similar PFF grades. So on a play-by-play accounting of their season ends you up in a very similar spot, right? 75.5 for Kenny Pickett, 76.6 for Brock Purdy. Similar kind of difference in terms of passing grade. Very close. Brock Purdy basically a grading point higher across the board. But statistically, Kenny Pickett has 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Purdy had 13 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. And, any box score type of stat says Brock Purdy was like light years ahead. But actually, like Kenny Pickett had a big-time throw rate of 4.3%, which is actually pretty good. Like that's the same as Dak Prescott. It's 0.1 behind Kirk Cousins. It's who else was in that area that was actually an impressive name? It's a pretty good mark. It's middle of the pack, but Tua was at 4.3%. It's a good spot to be in. Purdy's was nowhere near that level because he's just sort of operating this Kyle Shanahan offense, which, the main feature of which is like just take what I give you and you'll have incredible numbers.
You don't need to have big time throws.
So you've got two guys that, let's say, broadly speaking, are playing similarly, but one of them is being like sent to the moon because he's in a cheat code of an offense, and the other one is being dragged down by a system that doesn't even run routes in the middle of the field. It's like completely opposite ends of the spectrum. So the difference in like perception for those two guys could not be further apart. Like Brock Purdy, we found like the next Tom Brady in the last pick of the draft. This is amazing. And Kenny Pickett, it's like, is he even the guy in Pittsburgh? Maybe. Like he flashed a little bit. But
not in Pittsburgh, by the way.
No.
You're talking
sure.
nationally.
Yes.
Pittsburgh, and I'm not just talking about my friends on the PM show here. But like in Pittsburgh, it's like, Kenny Pickett, year two. Look at the other year two quarterbacks. Joe Burrow went to the Super Bowl, and Patrick Mahomes won a Super Bowl, and an MVP, and Lamar was an MVP, and Pickett's going to do that.
Right. But the problem becomes, what if the system doesn't stop dragging him down? Like they might be right that Kenny Pickett has that kind of ability, and we could be looking at a potential Pro Bowl or All-Pro here. But if the system doesn't change, he will continue to get dragged down by it, and he will average 6.2 yards per attempt, and he'll have more interceptions and touchdowns. And, these things could repeat if the system doesn't help him out. And that's the big concern.
So one of Pickett's first games, playing the Dolphins, Sunday Night Football, he's got a fourth quarter comeback attempt and throws a terrible game-ending interception. It's like, oh, man, just doesn't have the traits, just doesn't do it. But then you've got like Christmas Eve against the Raiders, a couple other games in there where he had a little of that late game magic. And I think that's where Steelers fans are most optimistic about Pickett. And that's where I might be swayed a little bit with the pedestrian stats, but loved what he did with the game on the line in a couple different games down the stretch. So I think Pickett will be fine. He'll be solid. I just don't know if that's enough to overcome the other three quarterbacks, in particular in this division.